More like the boss of having his shirt off. Oh, I think you heard that. All right, Rel, be cool. It's just a tall, super strong armored lady. Oh, so your name's Echo. That's cool. I'm cool. You're cute, Seraphine. Well, bye.
Hello, orphans and ontologists. My name is DBSkyne, and I have been cleaning my apartment all week, which has flared up my dust allergies something fierce, so if my voice sounds a little strained, that will be why. Anyway, talk about a change of pace for a champion release, huh? Seraphine was all bound up in the Worlds ceremony and the ultimate skin and the whole KDA thing, and Rel, by contrast, was much more of a traditional character release for League of Legends. She got a little bit of build-up with a few teasers here and there. Samira's color story particularly teased a connection between the two, and then she was released. And everyone just kind of seemed to move on after that. And there hasn't, at least that I've seen, been a lot of discussion or discourse or even really that much fan art of Rel coming out in the aftermath of her release. There wasn't a lot of hype around it. Riot didn't really seem to push it that hard from a promotional perspective. And in pro play, at least so far, her impact has been less than overwhelming. Now, Rel has plenty of interesting story hooks, and there's a bunch of fun stuff going on, and she has probably one of the best champion themes that League of Legends has added in a long time, so I guess it's worth asking, posters across Noxus warn of a dangerous criminal, armed with a massive blunted spear and borne atop a magical fiend, whose mere existence poses a threat to the safety and security of the entire nation. Even some within the steeled ranks of the Trifarian Legion have begun to worry that they will be sent after her, to their almost certain deaths. What kind of monster could be behind such heinous, unchecked destruction? The simple answer is a 16-year-old girl. The complicated one is unforgivable. Rel is the child of a minor and fallen Noxian noble house. She grows up not in poverty, but certainly not in the kind of opulence and privilege that nobles are accustomed to. Her parents, being good Noxians, are determined to rectify this problem, and they see Rel as their means to do so. Because as fate would have it, Rel is born with a rare magical ability to manipulate metal, an ability which catches the attention of a certain pale lady, who shows up and offers to make Rel the star pupil of a special academy and thus rescue the family's fortunes. And if this had been a happier story, the academy might have been a lovely place full of eccentric teachers and strange lessons where Rel would become friends with a group of misfits, and she'd have like a haughty rival who like mocks her for being lowborn or whatever, but then she proves herself because she's good at doing the special metal magic, and they'd go on adventures, and there would be a romance subplot with the cute guy from the other class where they're kind of rivals, but they're also kind of interested in each other, and you know, they have a coming of age thing where they sort of learn and grow into their own persons and become better, more complete people by the end. But this is Noxus, and happy stories like that are few and far between. No, instead what happens is that Rel is forced into combat with the other students of the academy, and each one that she defeats, she never sees again. Simultaneously, and probably completely unrelated to that, they also give her strange tattoos that seem to increase her magical powers. How odd. Eventually, Rel becomes terrifyingly powerful with the help of the magical sigils, and decides that she has had quite enough of the cruelty that's being done to her. She casts aside her instructors and explores the academy for herself, finding in a sealed-off wing of the building her former classmates who have been nullified. Their magic has been forcibly extracted and turned into the sigils that they kept grafting onto Rel to make her stronger. As you may imagine, Rel does not react particularly well to that, and she reacts even worse when she finds out that the headmistress of this academy, the person who ordered these things to happen, was her own mother. Tearing the academy to shreds in a rage and freeing as many of the other students as she can, she rides off and vows to use the power that she has to tear apart the Black Rose, which is responsible for what happened to her, and the very empire of Noxus itself as well. So Rel and her story is a fairly recognizable trope. You may recognize it from Jack from the Mass Effect series, or Eleven from Stranger Things. A child with extraordinary abilities who is taken away by an immoral organization to be experimented upon as a test subject, but who eventually breaks free and begins to use their powers for their own ends. On a broader level, she also acts as a reminder of the true nature of Noxus. Noxus began its life in League of Legends as the stereotypical evil fantasy kingdom ruled over by tyrants, as opposed to the good fantasy kingdom ruled over by a benevolent king that was Demacia. Over the past several years, though, Riot has been working to kind of dismantle that strict good and evil fantasy kingdom binary, showing us that Demacia is indeed capable of doing a whole genocide all of its own, and that Noxus, for characters especially like Samira, can act as a kind of land of opportunity, a place for refugees to go and find a place to belong, because Noxus embraces all who are willing to embrace Noxus. Rel, on the other hand, is a reminder of what Noxus also stands for, which is strength above all else. As her own mother tells her, there is no excellence without sacrifice, even when that sacrifice is children. Now, Swain and Darius and the nominal government of Noxus were not, of course, or at least probably, aware of what was happening with Rel in the Null facility, but it's worth remembering that thematically, the Black Rose is a representation of the shadow side of Noxus, the dark side of all these idealistic visions of a perfect meritocracy where anyone can come and prove themselves and become a part of something greater. The activities of the Black Rose, particularly characters like Vladimir and Elise, are reminders that any such hierarchical society, by its nature, will reward those who are willing to fuel their own rise to power by being parasites in the lives of others. Now, a full discussion of this should really be left to a Politics of Noxus video, which, goddammit, I need to do someday. But suffice it to say for the moment that the Null Academy, where they quite literally did blood sacrifice of children in order to produce a sufficiently powerful individual to serve their ideological needs, and presumably also to act as a weapon against Mordekaiser, is a perfect expression of the dark side of Noxian exceptionalism, where excellence is measured in sacrifice. Rel is a 16-year-old girl. I bring this up because we did say so at the very beginning of the lore section, but having a look at her now, I just thought I would remind you that Rel is a 16-year-old girl. She's a child. 16-year-old girls are children, and that's kind of a big part of her story. That's why what happened to her was so horrifying, is because she was just a child with absolutely no say in the things that were done to her. It's a big part of her story that she is a child and that she is 16. Rel does not look like a 16-year-old girl. Now, of course, characters who don't quite look like the age that they're supposed to be is a pretty common thing in media. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, for example, attempts to convince us that this man is 17, which, okay, it's a common side effect of stylization, that the kinds of subtle details that really mark out a character's specific age can get flattened out and smoothened, and things can end up getting a little weird. Anime is famous for this, but it happens in Western media as well. The difference, though, between an example like Rel and an example like Jotaro is that Jotaro is the protagonist of an anime called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, a hyper-stylized, sometimes schlock horror, sometimes comedy anime, where, among other things, people have ghost Pokemon battles against a vampire named for a progressive rock band. So the character designs are weird and over-the-top and hyper-stylized to heighten the bizarreness of the adventure. Rel, on the other hand, is not on a bizarre adventure. Rel is the protagonist of a tragedy and a revenge story, and we are meant to take her very seriously indeed. The fact that Rel is a 16-year-old girl is core to her character's narrative. This is a child who was brutalized and abused institutionally by the nation of Noxus, someone who's really not supposed to shoulder this kind of burden or hold this kind of power, but who has had it forced upon her unwillingly at the cost of the lives of others. It is important to her character that she's 16. It is important that she is a child. And so it is kind of disappointing when you look at her character design and you go, oh, well, she looks like she's in exactly the same early to mid-20s age range as every single other woman in League of Legends. And you might say that, hey, isn't that kind of part of the point of Rel, that she was forced to grow up way too quickly? Wouldn't it make sense to have that reflected in her character design by having her have a body that's too old for her actual age? And I would say that's a very cool concept and a really cool idea, and I have absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe that that's what Riot were attempting to do here, because, like I said, she looks exactly the same age as pretty much every single other woman in League of Legends. If League had a long tradition of making careful, considered choices about the body morphology of the women that it puts in its video games, and not just one or two interesting exceptions that they then never repeated, then I'd be willing to entertain the idea that Rel looks the way she does for an interesting reason, rather than looking the way she does because that's the standard look for every single woman in fantasy action video games, and the corporate culture at Riot Games is hostile to producing anything other than that. I can flat out guarantee you that in the concept art for Rel, most of which we haven't really been shown, she will have had a number of potential looks that will have been way closer to actually making her look like a 16-year-old girl that got sanded down and homogenized over time because, well, that's what corporate culture does to artistic expression. Just look at what happened to Kai'Sa. Anyway, that's enough complaining about what isn't there. Let's take a look at what is there. And what is there is two character designs that, except for rather missing the mark about presenting her age, actually have a lot going for them. Rel is two kinds of knight character. First, the mounted cavalier with her spear charging into battle, and then the heavily armored foot soldier protected behind an immovable shell of metal. And what I find quite brilliant about Rel's character design is that both the horse and the suit of armor are designed to look like exactly the same metal shapes and pieces, so that when she goes from one form to another, she's not really creating a new horse or creating a new suit of armor, she's simply reshaping what she already has to suit her needs. I think that's very clever. In her grounded, armored form, the armor is placed on her body in such a way to really bulk out her physical shape. She becomes this big fortress of overlapping metal shapes that looks, frankly, quite intimidating, especially when she's striding towards you with her home guard animation, but more on that later. By contrast, when she forms the armor into its horse form and rides atop it, she's actually kind of slim and lithe. Now, don't get me wrong, Rel has some muscles on their arms, which is a nice thing to see from character design in League of Legends. But when she's mounted, she simultaneously looks a lot faster and more agile, but also a lot more vulnerable, which, especially from a gameplay perspective, is definitely the intention. So there's a strong and clear visual contrast between her two forms, with a strong central identifying feature, namely her bright shock of golden yellow hair, which makes her tremendously recognizable in both forms and is a really good central iconic character feature that keeps her from being solely identified by the metal plates that form her horse and her armor. So from a practical perspective, Rel is a really good character design. When you see her in-game, you are never in doubt about which form she's currently occupying, and you can clearly read that her tank form is really durable and hard to kill, and that her horse form is probably faster and more agile. From a gameplay design perspective, very good character design. From a character storytelling perspective, well, Rel's champion theme sounds like this. But Rel's character design looks like it should sound more like this.
I love working for Uncle Sam.
I love working for Uncle Sam.
Lets me know just who I am.
Lets me know just who I am.
As we've already harped on about, Rel is a teenager. She's 16, but more than that, she's an angry teenager. Her entire story is about raging against the machine, being brought up in an abusive institution by terrible parents in order to serve political goals that she fundamentally does not agree with. She is effectively, although perhaps not consciously, an anarchist, someone who seeks to overthrow unjust power systems and dismantle abusive hierarchies. She is driven by mistrust, trauma, and more than anything else, rage. It is in a fit of rage that she destroys the academy, and it is anger and righteous fury that drives her in her quest to dismantle pretty much all of Noxus. But if you were to just look at her character design, if you were to look at the sleek, regular, well-composed lines of the horse that she rides, the sensible layered sheets of metal that make up her armor, the smooth and regular lines that inform her design aesthetic, you wouldn't really get the impression of someone who is hurt, angry, raging, and lashing out. She looks like a soldier, and a pretty well-trained one at that. Someone driven by discipline, planning, and tactics, which I think is really not the character that the story is presenting to us. Rel's armor and equipment wasn't forged by a smith. It wasn't made by someone with careful considerations of how armor is supposed to look and how weapons and armament are supposed to work. She pulled them out of the ground and formed them together in a blind, vengeful rage. Her powers of ferromancy are not an act of careful science, it is an emotional extension of who she is as a person, something we shall actually see once we take a look at her animations. And given that her powers are an extension of who she is as a person, I would have thought that maybe you'd show more of her personality in the kind of armor that she puts together, something that isn't disciplined and well-composed, sensible, or balanced, but something which is roughly formed, something that looks like she tore it out of the earth with the power of her mind, and shaped to suit her whims depending on what she needs at any given moment, something that is covered in spikes and nodules, something that looks as twisted and angry as she is. Essentially, I'm kind of wondering why Rel doesn't look a little bit more like pre-rework Mordekaiser. Because, especially for a champion whose champion theme sounds like this, the look that Rel has ended up with is really kinda boring? Like, not boring as in being a bad design, but boring as in being understated and restrained and kind of conservative. She looks like someone who was calmly and sensibly put together by someone with a clear idea and a plan for how her armor should work and what it should look like. But that's not really who Rel is, according to her story. According to her story, she's a bomb with a permanently lit fuse just looking for the right Noxian to blow up at. So with Rel, like with a few other champions in the past, what we have here is a really damn good, sensible, cool design with a really fun transforming mechanic between the armor and the horse that is, unfortunately, not really doing a very good job of telling the story of the character that it was attached to. So, let's have a look at Rel's animations, because they are one place where this character really does shine quite a bit. And we'll start with this one, probably one of her simplest animations, because this is just her mounted idle animation, and it should be pretty obvious what's going on. She's just sitting there, breathing. But someone else is breathing too, the horse. And on the face of it, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because there isn't a horse there. It's a bunch of armor plates sort of vaguely arranged into the shape of a horse, but the horse itself doesn't breathe. So what's going on? Well, there's a bit of character storytelling going on here. Rel's ferromancy, her magic, is an extension of herself. Like, she's born with this power. It is empowered through the horrifying behavior of the people at the Institute. And then it manifests itself, physically, as her armor and as this horse that she likes to ride. And so one of the ways that the animator is doing that storytelling is by giving the horse itself an interesting little breathing animation. As Rel's chest expands and deflates, these armor plates on the top of the horse's head go up and down. You can see that the torso of the horse moves around, contracts, and moves about a bit. And the horse's butt for some reason, also rises and falls with Rel's breathing. Now, looking at these animations like this, especially Rel's chest, like, you can really see how much it inflates and deflates, and it looks a little silly when looking at it so close up. But as you should always remember, League of Legends character models are meant to be viewed more or less like this, and from that distance, and when the character model is so small, the animation needs to be somewhat exaggerated in order to get across what's really happening here. From this distance, Rel's breathing animation looks downright subtle. And I really like this. This is something that happens over and over again in Rel's animation, especially where she interacts with her horse. The horse seems to have a life and personality of its own, imbued within it entirely by the animation, even though there is, as we have discussed, no actual horse there. And I don't think there is a better demonstration of it than her dance. This is just absolutely delightful. At least I think so. Look at this horse. Look at how he's prancing. He's doing a little kicking out with the legs and prancing about like he's a horse doing a horse show of some... I don't know anything about equestrianism, but he's doing a little dancing around horse show, and she's like banging with the thing to set the rhythm and stuff. And there's a little twist to the horse dance as well, which is that sometimes Rel will just poke her lands out, and the horse will do this little whoop-a-boo, this adorable little jump, just jumping over like a show horse. And once it finishes the jump, take a look at what it does with its head. It sort of shakes its head back and forth, almost as though it's kind of celebrating that it managed to get this this little move right. So let's take a closer look at what's happening during this animation. And by the way, shout-outs to Teemo.gg and their model viewer, which I'm using for these segments. They've added a bunch of new features recently, including the ability to render or not render certain parts of the characters that are on screen, which is an absolute delight. And especially they've added this animation speed toggle, like really fine-grained animation speed toggle, which for our purposes is going to be very useful indeed, because now you can really see what's going on with this horse's animation and how complicated a piece of animation this is, where Rel's horse is composed of dozens and dozens of independently floating little bits of armor. And I just think this is so impressive, like, just to look at, because the thing about something like this, like, you can rig a character model like this the same way that you would rig a solid body. Like, you can rig it in the same way so that things move, like, have these interdependencies of how they move according to one another in the same way as a solid body. I've seen it done, but if you want to get the absolute most out of animation like this, you have to do stuff like what they're doing with the head plates on the horse there. Look what happens. Each one of them individually, as the horse rises, you can see they reach the apex of their movement, and then they fall down independently of one another. 1, 2, 3. Like, duk, duk, duk. They all fall down independently, and the same thing happens around the butt part of the horse. Like, these 3 plates right here, all of them have this independent floating animation of one another, where they're clearly not, like, tied up or completely connected to one another. They're floating free of each other, and it's just like, seeing it move like this, like, someone has to do all of this. Everything you see here, every little bit of movement, everything that the horse armor does as it moves around, an animator made a decision about that at some point. And they had to have a rigger, which is the character, like, generally in 3D animation, you have 2 people responsible for a character. You have the animator, the lead animator, who's the person who usually takes care of, you know, actually making the thing move, but someone who's equally important is the rigger, who is the person who doesn't create the model, but they create the skeleton inside the model, all the little control points, all the little tools that the animator can use to move the model around. And a really good animation rig allows you to do a million interesting things that you can't really do if you have a bad animation rig. A bad animation rig, like, good animators can create good animation from pretty much anything. A bad animation rig doesn't preclude good animation, but it limits the scope of what is reasonably possible. And so this horse thing, like, I shudder to think about the complexity of just how this thing is rigged to cohere as a single model, the interdependencies between the various pieces that are going on, yet still having the freedom to animate each piece of the horse independently of one another. You can see it on the midriff here as well, like the saddle bit of the horse, how the 3 ribs move somewhat independently of one another too. You can see it there, like how they fall down independently of one another. I'm not well versed enough in the discipline of like animation rigging and creating animation models for this kind of animation to really speak to how much work went into it, but to me it looks damn impressive. Like that, so much work must have gone into making this work, like making it look right. Like, and usually, of course, in-game, you're not gonna watch the animation go by this slowly, but the fact that it still looks good, like, even when it's moving this slow, like, there's a little bit of clipping you can see, like, with the leg through the thing and stuff. Something you won't notice when it's in full motion. But the fact that this works is, like, that's damn impressive. Like, just as a technical feat, this little horse guy here, just... I love looking at this thing. Like, look at it. Look how the pieces kind of float. Like, it's just really good. Like, look at that. Man. When you look at animation like this, when you slow it down, sometimes it's just a miracle, man. Sometimes it's just a miracle that this nonsense even works, that it even fits together. And then you see it in full motion, and it's like, shit, that horse is alive, right? It's alive, and yet you get that sense that despite being a horse that seems to be alive, it's also this pile of metal. Like, you can kind of see how, like, it's sort of, it looks like you'd get that sound from, like, ka-chunk, 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 as the metal plates clatter against each other with every movement that the damn thing makes. It's just real good. Like, I love the animation on Rel's horse, especially, because, like, there's so many things going on, and the little prance, like, it just looks so happy, doesn't it? Like, that little like, it just looks like it's having fun, and it doesn't have an expression, it's just a bunch of metal plates, but you get that character expressiveness through its movement. That's just like, mwah, absolutely wonderful. Here's something I really like. Rel's critical hit animation. Basically, she rears up her horse like this. She does this jump into the air, and the horse just, like, wham-bam, does this massive kick. Because I love the way that this horse kick is animated. Take a look at this. Look how clever that is. Like, so we always, like, with League of Legends characters, let's see if we can find one of Rel's other attack animations. Like, League of Legends attack animations always have these, like, really... these really extreme model deformations. Let's see if we can get the lance metal on this thing as well. That are used to deliver the power of the hit. So you can see here as Rel's lance reaches its apex, as it's actually hitting the enemy, it gets inflated, it gets really big, like, and it gets really distorted, and she gets, like, really, like, crazy stretched in order to make this work. There's a lot of exaggeration going on here to really deliver the power of the hit. And on a normal character model, that always looks kind of, well, it looks a little silly and awkward, and we've had a lot of fun sort of documenting that stuff on the channel before, like... like so. And what I really like about the critical hit animation is that it grabs something that's already natural to the model, is saying, like, hey, actually, we don't need to stretch the horse model. We don't need to do this cartoonish stretching of the model the same way that we do with Rel, where the arm gets way too long and things get weirdly inflated. We can just use the fact that this horse is made of pieces to let the model do this thing naturally with barely any model distortion. Like, they do a little bit of inflation of the hooves as they hit. Like, you get this inflation so the hooves are extra big, and then they deflate down to normal size again as we come back to the normal stance. But they use the fact that the horse is already in pieces, so they can just, like, make the pieces float further from one another, further from one another, like so, as though they're held together with string, rather than actually stretch out the individual armor pieces and sort of distort the horse model. And I think it's a little thing, but I just think it's really clever that, okay, we'll just make the things float farther apart in order to stretch the horse. Where, like, again, if the animation rigging had not been set up to allow this kind of thing, we would probably have had a thing where they just stretched out all the armor plates in order to make the back of the horse's body that long, right? But just the fact that they make them float freely like this, like, it's so clever. And it's just such a lovely way to use the nature of the character model. Anyway, we've talked a lot about the horse animation. Maybe we should actually talk about... maybe we should talk about Rel's animation. And Rel has some very fun animation smears of her own. This is as she goes into her joke. The little trick that they pull off is that in order for Rel to do her joke, she needs this. Like, she lands on, like, a fairground toy version of her little horse. And so the way that they handle that, this is not the same horse model that she normally rides. It's a different horse model that they spawn in. And the way they do it, you can see it right here, they spawn it in as a little tiny thing that, from the perspective of looking at it, like from an in-game perspective, you'd never be able to spot that in the instant that it exists. Before it inflates up to its normal size and we get the full landing down on the thing. But that's just like, it was one of those little itty-bitty tiny shrimp horse spawning in as the pedestal that the horse is going to attach to spawns in from the ground below. And Rel, well, say hello to long Rel. She's very long. She's jumping up into the air and getting longer all the time. Deforming back into her normal shape as she reaches the apex of the leap, and then the horse falls down. It attaches to the thing on the ground, and then she seems rather surprised by the whole thing. I imagine this must kind of hurt the way that she's landing on that thing. I love smear frames. I love squash and stretch. It's so good, especially on 3D models. As she comes down and lands, you can see all of a sudden, oh, here we have wide Rel. Just getting all squashed down. Landing on it, and then the thing kicks into action. Which has a lovely little sort of stuttering mechanical, like, kind of movement as, like, it kicks into action. You can see how it vibrates first, as though it's being kicked into action like an old mechanical thing that runs on gears and stuff. And then you get into the cycle. Let's set that up to normal speed so you can see how it really is supposed to look. Then we get back up to the cycle where... as Rel is riding the little horse, she's even looking up at the player. Like, again, this is the perspective you'd see it in-game. She's looking up at the player with this expression like... I don't know what that expression is, but she seems like she's having fun. Which I think is lovely. Like, I really like this. Like, I really like this little joke that she can ride her horse like a fairground ride. Like, that little bit of childishness that's in there. And it's part of her joke, obviously. We're not supposed to take that too seriously, but that there is a little bit of childishness and fun to the character. And as I talked about, when we talked about the character design, you can see, like, here's the horse's head, here's pieces of the flank, there's a bit of, like, the rib cage and stuff. You can see parts of the horse that you recognize from the horse model in her armor design as she's moving around in her armor. And here again, we get that same thing I talked about with the horse, where the armor shards, like these plates of armor, are not attached to one another. They're floating freely in space, and you can see them like almost like a skirt, which is also, I think, how the concept artist described her, is that they essentially used the armor skirts on her hips to create a kind of sort of feminine feeling to her. Like, they created a sort of like emphasize this hourglass shape thing that's going on, which I think is a good way to use armor design, frankly, to emphasize like the identity of the character underneath. Like, without resorting to stuff that looks ridiculous like the boob plate, but you have these wide armor skirts that, like, genuinely would provide a lot of protection against certain kinds of attacks, and that, like, they look like they're powerful armor. They don't look like boob plate, which has a tendency to look really thin and kind of fragile. These things look like you could probably fire a shotgun at them and you wouldn't even leave a dent. You can see here again how each piece of the skirt moves independently of the rest of them, and how the skirt at the bottom is almost as though it's hanging from a rope that's attached to her hip, where it's swinging back and forth, sort of just a little bit out of step with her leg, because as her leg comes back and, like, here it starts to move forward, that thing is still moving backwards, and then it follows her leg forwards slowly. So you have this reciprocal action where it looks like she's swinging those armor pieces off the sides of her, which again makes sense because these are not attached to anything. They're held onto her by her magnetism, by her ferromancy. Her magic is holding them on. They're not welded together. So you get this lovely free-floating kind of swaying skirt feel to them that works really well for the character. And adds a lot of sort of secondary motion to her stride forwards, which in my opinion, here's a lovely detail. Look at that. Look at how her, again, like we talked about on the horse, the little jokey horse ride animation, the way that her head kind of follows her body on a little bit of a delay, especially on the second stride, as we shall see her neck really gets to elongate. Which again, you're not supposed to look at it from this angle, you're supposed to look at it from here, and that exaggeration serves the movement. You can see how her head gets this little bobblehead kind of motion, where it kind of wiggles back and forth, and you can see the hair is being used to accentuate that as well. Where that elongation works really well for her. But for me also, like the swaying of these skirts, like the way that they kind of swing back and forth, it adds a lot of power to her stride. Like this is her home guard animation when she's in her armored form, and like, that's a power walk, isn't it? Like, that's a walk that says, I'm not only going to step on you, I'm going to crush you beneath my heels, and I'm not going to look back when your corpse is littering the ground behind me. This is a get the hell out of my way or I will move you kind of stride. Which works really well for her because she's supposed to be this battle tank when she's in this mode. Like, she's supposed to be this thing of, like, you might not want to get in the way of that. You might want to keep your distance, actually, because your only hope is to be faster than she is to get away from this unstoppable force that's looking for a movable object to collide with. So, returning to the question with which we began this video, why did Rel land with such relatively little fanfare and interest? And I think it's a couple of things. She landed in the publishing cycle between Samira and Seraphine on the one side, two champions who got a lot of attention and fanfare, and then Viego, the Ruined King, on the other side, a champion who's apparently going to define an entire season, as well as spin-off games and God knows what else Riot has planned. And under those circumstances, it would be hard for any character to stand out, not to mention the publishing resources required by characters like Seraphine and Viego, as well as presumably the compressing effects of COVID in screwing up the publishing schedule. All of that conspires to create an unfavorable environment for any champion to be released into. And when it comes to gauging the quality of Rel's reception, the sheer lack of promotional muscle put behind her by Riot is probably at least half the reason why this character didn't generate more hype with the community. The other half, I think, is just the conservative nature of Rel's character and the relative lack of connection that she has to the established popular storylines in League of Legends. When Demacia got its very own king-slaying anarchist, Sylas, he was released with strong connections to Lux, Garen, and Jarvan, the main power players in Demacia, and those intense emotional connections led to storytelling that was extremely engaging for anyone who already cared about those characters. Rel, on the other hand, comes pretty much from nowhere and has no strong character connections to anyone. Oh, yeah, she hates LeBlanc, she hates Noxus, she would probably kill Swain and Darius if she had the opportunity, but there's no enmity there, no personal relationship, no rivalry, no connection that people who are fans of Swain and Darius can feed on in order to create stories between these characters in their heads. And then there's Rel's character design. Her story tells us that she's an angry, violent, anarchistic, tear down the man, rage against the machine, destroyer of nations, but her character design, if anything, has her looking like a good soldier. Her design is toned down, sensible, and deeply restrained for a character whose whole thing is raging against restraints. All of Rel's passion, all of Rel's anger is completely subsumed and contained by the demureness of her character design. It's sleek and it's well composed and it's nice, but it doesn't look passionate. It doesn't look angry. It doesn't look furious. It doesn't look like the righteous hammer of the downtrodden coming to claim the lives of the Noxian nobility who let them suffer. All the potential excitement of her story and her personality is, at least in my opinion, subsumed and rendered too respectable by the character design to be exciting. Which is why we've been looking at this for the past few minutes. I turned over some of my thoughts and ideas about Rel's character design with a concept artist I know called AppleCore, and then I paid them to try and render out a version of Rel that would at least visually express some more of her anger, some more of the excitement of the character that I've been missing from her story so far. Now, this is by no means a perfect design. We haven't worked out how this would translate into the horse form, for example. It's just a relatively simple revisionist pass to show that it would be possible, without fundamentally changing Rel's character design, but simply changing the way that that design is presented, to use her armor and her visuals to communicate someone who is always smoldering with barely repressed rage just beneath the surface, someone who is mistrustful and hurt and keeps other people at a prickly distance, a character design that uses some of the pre-existing aesthetic history of punk and metal music to create the visual identity of someone who's out to tear down the system. Now, I will not call this a fix for Rel's character design, because art and design are creative disciplines and therefore fundamentally subjective. I can no more fix a character design than I can fix a poem. This version of Rel is not objectively better, it is merely an opinion about Rel backed up with arguments. And if you have some of those of your own, I'd be interested to hear them in the comments. Hey, thank you very much for watching another episode of What's the Deal With? I hope you enjoyed it. I decided to try something this time around that people have been asking me to do since forever and actually do, well, not 100% my own take on the character design to address some of my critiques, but certainly a take with a little bit of help. And if you enjoyed the art of AppleCore, who helped me out with that, well, you might be seeing some more of their work on this channel sometime in the future. Who can say? In the meantime, you should go check them out on ArtStation and Instagram, because they do some damn fine work. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, do all the other things that you're supposed to tell people to do on YouTube, because click a thing and the algorithm says, hey, someone clicked a thing, and that means the video is good, so let's show the video to people. So if you want to help me out, certainly do appreciate that. If you want to help me out more directly than that, then I have a Patreon, a merchandise store, a tip jar. There's plenty of monetization options, so if you want to give me a tip of some kind, then those options are available for you. But if you're not in a position to be able to do that, or hell, if you just don't want to, please don't worry about it. It's completely okay. As usual, though, I will encourage you to, if there is online content that you enjoy, please consider supporting it directly with anything you can, whenever you can. Because especially if there are smaller or niche content creators whose work you enjoy, giving them that $1 or $2 donation can quite literally be the same as thousands of views on a video. Even a small amount of help makes much more of a difference than you think. Anyway, last bit of self-promotion. I have a second channel. I do Let's Plays of stuff over there. I have been playing through Hades for quite a while, which people seem to really be enjoying. I certainly am. I just beat Hades on Extreme Measures 4, and I'm still feeling very pleased about myself. But there's also other stuff going on over there, like a playthrough of the original Diablo from 1996, discussing some of the changes that were made to that series and how it lost a little bit of its original magic, as well as, you know, maybe we'll go to space soon. And also, I built a little town, and it was very chill, and people thought it had, like, Bob Ross vibes, so if you want any of that, like, comment, subscribe over there as well, I guess. Anyway, thank you once again for watching. Please remember to wear a mask and wash your hands. When the vaccine comes, I am begging you all to take it, and try to act in solidarity with those who are working to make the world a better place.